Nathaniel Nate Blackwood had spent years constructing an empire where nothing slipped through his grasp. Blackwood Investments wasn't just a firm, it was a powerhouse, dominating Wall Street with unrelenting precision. At 39, he had reached the pinnacle of success, a billionaire whose name alone commanded respect and, at times, fear. But sitting by the infinity pool of an exclusive Miami Beach resort, the empire he built felt hollow. The sun cast golden reflections over the water, the rhythmic crash of waves in the distance adding to the illusion of paradise. Around him, luxury thrived, women draped in designer bikinis, men in tailored linen sipping imported scotch. A waiter discreetly placed a fresh glass of bourbon on the small table beside him, but Nate barely acknowledged it. He wasn't here for indulgence, or maybe he was. This vacation, if he could even call it that, had been forced on him. His COO and closest friend, Ethan Carter, had practically shoved him onto his private jet, insisting that he needed time away from constant boardroom wars. Nate had scoffed at the suggestion, but, as usual, Ethan had been right. The exhaustion had crept up on him, the kind of fatigue that no amount of luxury could erase. He exhaled slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his crisp white shirt. The cufflinks gleamed, solid gold, custom-made. Everything in his life was curated, refined, expensive. Yet there were nights he lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline, wondering what any of it really meant. "Enjoying your vacation, Mr. Blackwood?" A feminine voice purred beside him. He glanced up to see a striking brunette, someone he vaguely recognized from a charity gala months ago. She leaned in, her diamond-studded bracelet glinting under the Miami sun. "You've been staring at that drink for 20 minutes. Deep in thought?" Nate gave her a practiced smirk, the kind that often made women lean closer. "Something like that." She crossed her legs, the movement calculated. "Perhaps you need a distraction." He considered her offer, or rather the ease of it. But something inside him hesitated, a reluctance that had nothing to do with the woman and everything to do with himself. Before he could answer, a movement in his periphery caught his attention. A small shadow, a blur of dark curls. A child. Nate frowned. Children didn't belong in places like this. Miami Beach's elite resorts catered to privacy and excess, not families. He expected to see a frantic mother or nanny chasing after her, but the little girl stood alone, gripping a well-worn teddy bear. His first instinct was to ignore her, someone else's problem. But then she took a step closer, her gaze locking onto his with a determination that sent an unexpected jolt through him. "Mister," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. "Please help me. My mom won't wake up." For the first time in years, Nathaniel Blackwood felt something dangerously close to fear. Nate stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden deck. The brunette beside him barely registered his movement before he was stepping away, his sharp focus now locked on the little girl in front of him. "Where is your mom?" His voice was calm, but something deep inside him coiled tight, an instinctive reaction he couldn't quite explain. The girl, no older than 6, swallowed hard and pointed toward the resort's main building. "In our room. She won't wake up." Nate hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Take me to her." She turned on her small, bare feet and ran, her teddy bear bouncing against her chest with every step. Nate followed without question, his long strides easily keeping pace. The resort staff barely glanced their way, too accustomed to catering to the whims of billionaires to question where one of them was rushing off to. Inside, the lobby was a picture of extravagant calm. Chandeliers, marble floors, and a faint scent of imported vanilla. But to Nate, the air felt heavier, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with business. The girl led him up a flight of stairs past 2 long hallways and stopped in front of a slightly ajar door. Room 302. She hesitated. She's inside. Nate pushed the door open further. The room was dimly lit, curtains drawn tight, but he could see the still figure lying on the bed. A woman, dark hair fanned out against white sheets, motionless. He stepped closer, scanning the scene. On the nightstand beside her was a tipped-over bottle of pills. His stomach clenched. "Mom?" The girl's voice was small, scared. She moved forward and climbed onto the bed, pressing her little hands against the woman's arm. "Wake up." Nate reached for his phone, dialing emergency services. His usual detached, controlled demeanor had vanished, replaced by something rawer. He didn't know this woman, didn't know this child, and yet he couldn't walk away. "Yes, I have a woman unconscious in a hotel room," he said to the dispatcher, giving the address. "Possible overdose. She's breathing, but barely." A weak groan came from the bed, barely audible. The girl's eyes widened with hope. "Mommy?" Nate moved closer. The woman, Savannah James, stirred slightly but didn't wake. He clenched his jaw. He knew her. Too well. The name hit him like a fist to the ribs. Savannah James. 6 years had passed, but he'd recognize her anywhere. The delicate features, the soft curves of her face, the way her dark lashes rested against her pale skin. Time had touched her, but she was still the same woman who had once upended his world before vanishing from it entirely. And now she lay unconscious in a hotel bed with a child who had his eyes. The realization settled into him like a boulder sinking to the ocean floor. The paramedics arrived in a flurry of movement, filling the space with controlled urgency. Nate stepped back as they worked, checking Savannah's vitals, preparing to transport her to the hospital. The little girl clutched her teddy bear tighter, eyes darting between Nate and the strangers tending to her mother. "Can I go with her?" The lead paramedic, a woman with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor, knelt to the child's level. "We'll take good care of her, sweetheart. Do you have anyone we can call?" The girl hesitated, her small shoulders curling inward. Then, without looking at Nate, she murmured, "I don't know." Nate cleared his throat. "She's not going alone. I'll follow." The paramedic hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but you'll need to drive yourself." As they wheeled Savannah out of the room, the girl finally turned to look at him fully. "Are you coming?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Nate hesitated only a second before giving a single, firm nod. "Yeah, kid. I'm coming." For the first time in his life, Nathaniel Blackwood had no idea what he was walking into. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away. Nate sat in the hospital waiting room, his thoughts a tangled mess. The scent of antiseptic clung to the air, and the soft murmur of nurses discussing patient charts was the only thing keeping the silence from swallowing him whole. Lila sat beside him, her small fingers gripping the teddy bear tightly, her wide eyes fixed on the doors leading to the emergency room where Savannah had disappeared minutes ago. He had been in high-pressure boardroom negotiations, had outmaneuvered corporate titans in billion-dollar deals, and had turned failing companies into gold mines. Yet at this moment, he felt utterly powerless. Lila shifted slightly, hugging the bear closer. "Is my mom going to be okay?" she asked, her voice small but unwavering. Nate hesitated. He had never been one to sugarcoat the truth, but looking into those blue eyes, his blue eyes, he realized that he had never wanted to lie more in his life. "The doctors are taking care of her," he said, choosing his words carefully. "They'll do everything they can." She nodded as if accepting his answer, but her tiny frame still trembled. A nurse approached, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Blackwood, Savannah James is stable for now, but she's still unconscious. The attending doctor will speak to you shortly." Nate exhaled, tension coiling in his muscles. "Can we see her?" The nurse glanced at Lila and softened. You can sit with her, but only for a little while. He stood and placed a hand on Lila's shoulder, leading her through the double doors. Inside the room, Savannah lay against the hospital bed, an IV in her arm, her face pale under the fluorescent light. She looked fragile, and the sight of her like this rattled something in him that he had long since buried. Lila climbed onto the chair beside the bed, her small hands wrapping around Savannah's fingers. "Mommy, wake up," she whispered. "Please." Nate stood at the foot of the bed watching, feeling like an outsider in his own life. This wasn't supposed to be his reality. He had cut Savannah out years ago, convinced that love was nothing but an unnecessary complication. And yet, here he was, standing at the crossroads of a past he thought was buried, and a future he never saw coming. The doctor entered, flipping through Savannah's chart. "She's stable, but we need to keep her for observation. Do you know if she's been under stress?" Nate let out a humorless chuckle. "I'd say that's a fair assumption." The doctor nodded. "Her system was overwhelmed, but we didn't detect any life-threatening toxicity. It seems exhaustion and stress took a toll on her body. If she had taken more, it could have been worse." Lila let out a small breath, her grip on Savannah tightening. Nate turned to the doctor. "What happens now?" "We wait for her to wake up. In the meantime, I'd suggest ensuring she has support. Stress like this doesn't happen in isolation." Nate's jaw clenched. Savannah had been handling everything alone. Raising Lila, working, surviving, and he had been nowhere. As the doctor left, Lila turned to him, her expression wary. "Are you staying, mister?" He crouched beside her, leveling his gaze with hers. "My name is Nate," he said, voice quieter than usual. "And yes, I'm staying." She studied him for a long moment, then simply nodded before returning her focus to her mother. Nate sat in the chair on the other side of the bed, watching Savannah's chest rise and fall. He had spent years convincing himself he didn't need anyone, but looking at the woman he once loved and the child he never knew existed, he realized something terrifying. He had never been more wrong. Hours passed, but Savannah remained unconscious. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors filled the quiet hospital room, each sound a constant reminder of how fragile life could be. Nate shifted in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw, exhaustion pressing against him like an unseen force. But sleep was the last thing on his mind. Lila had fallen asleep curled up beside Savannah, her tiny hand still resting over her mother's. Nate watched the slow rise and fall of Savannah's chest, the steady but fragile proof that she was still here. A long-forgotten part of him ached at the sight of her, at how time had changed her, at how life had hardened her in ways he hadn't expected. He hadn't seen Savannah in 6 years, not since the night they had torn each other apart with words they couldn't take back. Back then, he had been too consumed by his company, too afraid of commitment, too blind to see that walking away from her had been the worst mistake of his life. And now, fate had forced him back into her world, or rather, into their world, because Lila wasn't just her daughter, she was his too. Nate exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had spent years making calculated decisions, never acting on impulse. But tonight, everything felt different. The control he so desperately clung to had slipped through his fingers the moment Lila had tugged on his sleeve by the pool. He had been in control of his life. Until now. A soft murmur pulled him from his thoughts. Savannah stirred, her fingers twitching slightly. His breath caught as he sat up, watching as her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she blinked in confusion, disoriented, her gaze darting around the room. Then her gaze landed on Lila, and a soft exhale left her lips. But then, her eyes shifted and locked onto his. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Her voice, when she finally found it, was hoarse and weak. "Nate?" He swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, it's me." Confusion flickered in her expression before realization hit. Her body tensed. "What are you doing here?" His jaw tightened. "I think we need to have a conversation." Savannah's gaze flickered between him and Lila, her fingers tightening around her daughters. Panic, hesitation, and something else, something more painful, flashed across her face. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured, barely audible. "You weren't supposed to know." Nate's stomach twisted, anger and regret warring within him. "But I do know now, Savannah, and I'm not going anywhere." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if trying to gather the strength to process what was happening. When she opened them again, they were filled with something far more complicated than just exhaustion. Fear. Nate wasn't sure if she was afraid of him, of the past, or of what this meant for their daughter, but he knew one thing. He wasn't walking away this time. Savannah tried to sit up, but the weight of exhaustion pressed her back against the hospital bed. Her body felt heavy, as though she had run a marathon and lost. The dim lighting of the room cast long shadows, but even in her disoriented state, she knew she wasn't alone. She felt Lila's warmth first. Her daughter's tiny hand rested on hers, a touch so familiar it brought a lump to her throat. Then, she felt the gaze. Intense, unwavering. Nate. She turned her head slowly, her breath hitching at the sight of him. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, something deeper than anger or frustration. It was something that scared her more than either of those things. "You're awake." His voice was quieter than she expected, rough from hours, maybe days, without sleep. Savannah swallowed hard. "Why are you here, Nate?" Her voice was weak, but the question carried all the weight of 6 years of silence. "I think you already know the answer to that." Her throat tightened. She did know. She had spent the past 6 years crafting a life without him, protecting Lila from the possibility of a man who had once told her he didn't want a family, a man who had chosen his empire over her. She had vowed never to let him find out, never to let him claim what he had abandoned. And yet, here he was. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lila." Nate's gaze flicked to the sleeping child beside her. "She came to me at the resort. She asked for my help." Savannah's heart clenched. Of course Lila had found him. Of all the people in that resort, she had unknowingly gone straight to the one man Savannah had tried to keep her from. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. "I didn't want this," she admitted, her fingers tightening around the sheets. "I didn't want you to know." Nate's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might explode. But when he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, laced with something more dangerous than anger. "You don't get to make that decision for me, Savannah. You took 6 years away from me, 6 years I can't get back." Guilt twisted in her stomach. "You told me you didn't want this life," she said, her voice barely steady. "I had no choice but to believe you." "I was a fool," Nate admitted, "but that doesn't change the fact that I deserved to know." Savannah closed her eyes, overwhelmed. She had spent years preparing for this moment, imagining all the ways Nate would react if he ever found out about Lila. And yet, none of those scenarios had prepared her for the reality of sitting in a hospital bed, looking into his eyes, and seeing what she feared most. He wasn't just angry. He was hurt. "So what now?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "What happens next?" Nate exhaled, leaning forward. "I don't know, but I do know one thing. I'm not leaving. Not again." A cold chill ran through her. "Nate? No." His voice was firm, unwavering. "We're going to figure this out, Savannah. I don't care how much you fight me on it. Lila is my daughter, and I intend to be in her life." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. And for the first time in 6 years, Savannah realized she might have finally lost control of the one secret she had fought so hard to protect. Savannah woke up to the feeling of warmth beside her. Lila had curled into her side at some point in the night, her small hand still gripping Savannah's fingers as though afraid she would disappear. But she wasn't alone. Across the room, Nate stood near the window, his posture rigid, hands tucked into the pockets of his expensive slacks. He had barely moved since their conversation hours ago, watching the city lights flicker outside as though waiting for answers he couldn't find. Her throat was dry when she finally spoke. "You stayed." His gaze flicked toward her, unreadable. "Of course I did." Savannah sighed and turned her head toward Lila, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. "She's everything to me, Nate. I did what I thought was best." "You thought keeping her from me was best?" The edge in his voice was sharp, but beneath it was something else, something raw. She closed her eyes for a moment. "You said you never wanted a family. You said you weren't meant for that life. So I made a choice. I wasn't going to beg you to love her." A long silence stretched between them before Nate finally spoke, his voice lower, strained. "You didn't even give me the chance to try." Savannah looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the cracks beneath his perfect control. He wasn't just angry. He was grieving the time he had lost. "I was scared, Nate," she admitted softly. "Scared that you'd push us away. And I couldn't risk her feeling unwanted." Nate ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. "I was an idiot back then. I know that. But I should have had the choice, Savannah. 6 years. I don't even know who she is. I've missed everything. Her first steps, her first words." His voice broke slightly, and Savannah felt it like a knife to the gut. "I know," she whispered, guilt pressing down on her like an unbearable weight. For the first time in years, she felt small under his gaze. Not because of his wealth or power, but because of the truth hanging between them, one neither of them could ignore anymore. Nate crossed the room slowly and crouched beside the bed. His hand hesitated before he reached for Lila's small one, his fingers barely brushing hers. "She looks like you," he murmured, his expression softening. "But those eyes, I see myself in them, and that terrifies me." Savannah's throat tightened. "She's strong, Nate, and stubborn. She's kind and smart, and she loves fiercely. You might have missed years with her, but you don't have to miss any more." He looked up at her, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "Do you mean that?" She nodded slowly, knowing that this moment, was the beginning of something new, something terrifying. But maybe, just maybe, it was also the start of healing. Nate took a deep breath and squeezed Lila's hand gently. "Then let's figure out where we go from here. Together." Savannah swallowed hard, realizing that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone in this. And maybe, just maybe, she never had to be again. Savannah sat up slowly, wincing as a dull ache spread through her limbs. The hospital bed was stiff, but it was nothing compared to the tension in the room. Nate remained in the chair beside her, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixated on the floor. Lila still slept soundly, curled against Savannah's side, oblivious to the storm brewing between the two adults in the room. Savannah cleared her throat, testing her voice. "You don't have to stay, you know." Nate looked up, his expression unreadable. "I told you already, I'm not leaving." She bit her lip, feeling torn between relief and frustration. She had spent 6 years learning how to survive without him, building walls around herself and her daughter. Now, in less than 24 hours, those walls were beginning to crumble, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. "This isn't going to be easy," she admitted, lowering her voice so she wouldn't wake Lila. Nate ran a hand through his hair, a muscle in his jaw tightening. "I don't expect it to be, but I deserve a chance to be in her life. And whether you like it or not, we need to figure out how to make that work." Savannah exhaled slowly. "And how do you think that works, Nate? You live in New York, we live here. You run a billion-dollar empire, and I work 2 jobs just to keep Lila's life stable. We don't exist in the same world anymore." "Then I'll make it work," he said simply. "I'll fly back and forth. I'll make time." Savannah shook her head. "You say that now, but your world is demanding. It always was. You barely had time for me back then, and I was in your life every day. What makes you think you can suddenly be a part of hers?" His gaze darkened. "I won't make the same mistake twice." Savannah wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that he would fight for their daughter the way he fought for his business deals. But experience had taught her that people didn't change overnight, and Nate Blackwood wasn't a man used to compromising. A knock at the door interrupted them. The nurse stepped inside, offering a polite smile. "Ms. James, the doctor wants to run a few more tests before we discharge you later today." Savannah nodded, her fingers tightening around Lila's. The nurse turned to Nate. "Are you the father? We'll need a second emergency contact for Lila." The air in the room shifted. Savannah stiffened, but Nate didn't hesitate. "Yes, I'm her father." The words hit Savannah harder than she expected. They were simple, factual, but hearing them aloud made everything more real. The nurse nodded, jotting something down on her clipboard. "Good. In case of any future emergencies, we'll have both parents listed." Savannah barely processed the rest of the nurse's words. Her mind was spinning, heart pounding. She had spent years protecting Lila from a father who, in her mind, had chosen to walk away before she was even born. But now, Nate wasn't just here. He was claiming his place. When the nurse left, Nate turned back to Savannah. "I meant what I said. I want to be in her life. And if that means adjusting my own, then I'll do it." She swallowed, her throat dry. "And what if she doesn't want you in her life, Nate? You're a stranger to her. She doesn't know you." Nate exhaled, his gaze flickering toward Lila. "Then I'll earn it." Savannah looked at him then, really looked at him. For the first time since their paths had collided again, she saw the sincerity beneath the controlled exterior. He wasn't just saying what she wanted to hear. He was saying what he needed to, for Lila. "Then we take this slow," she murmured. "One step at a time." His lips pressed into a firm line, but he nodded. "One step at a time." And for the first time, they weren't standing on opposite sides of the battlefield. They were meeting in the middle. Savannah sat in the wheelchair as the nurse pushed her through the hospital corridors. The sterile white walls and the beeping machines faded into the background as her mind churned with uncertainty. Lila walked beside her, clutching her hand tightly, and Nate followed close behind, his presence an anchor she wasn't sure she wanted. The nurse stopped at the front entrance. "You're officially discharged, Ms. James. Be sure to get plenty of rest. If you feel any dizziness or weakness, come back immediately." Savannah nodded. "Thank you." As they stepped outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the parking lot in golden light. Savannah reached for her phone, ready to call a rideshare, but Nate was already moving. "My car's this way." He gestured toward a sleek black sedan parked at the curb. Savannah hesitated. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said firmly, cutting off her protest. "Let me do this." She glanced down at Lila, who was watching the exchange quietly. If she refused, She risked making this transition harder for their daughter. With a sigh, she nodded. All right. Nate helped her into the passenger seat while Lila climbed into the back. The car smelled like leather, and something distinctly him. Clean, crisp, expensive. As the engine hummed to life, Savannah stole a glance at Nate. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, his jaw tense. This was new territory for both of them. The silence stretched until Nate finally spoke. "Where do you live?" Savannah gave him the address and he inputted into the GPS. "How long have you been there?" 3 years. Before that we moved around a lot." His fingers flexed against the wheel. "Because of me?" She exhaled. "Partly. At first I wanted to make sure you wouldn't find us, but then it was more about stability. Lila needed consistency." A muscle in his jaw ticked. "You didn't have to run, Savannah. I would have." "Would you?" She cut in softly. "Back then you didn't want to be a father. You didn't even want to talk about the future. You made your choice, Nate, and I made mine." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned onto her street, scanning the row of modest houses. It was a quiet neighborhood, nothing like the luxury he was used to. "Which one?" he asked. She pointed to a small but well-kept house with a blue door. "There." He pulled into the driveway, shutting off the engine. "It's nice." Savannah turned to look at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "It's home." Lila unbuckled herself and climbed out, running toward the front steps. Savannah started to follow, but Nate's voice stopped her. "Wait." She turned back. "What?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "I meant what I said about taking this slow, but I need to be involved. Here's my personal number. Not my office, not my assistant. Me. If you need anything, if Lila needs anything, call." Savannah took the card hesitantly. The weight of his words settled over her like a challenge. "I appreciate that. One more thing." His voice lowered. "I'd like to see her again soon. Can we set something up?" Savannah glanced toward the house where Lila was waiting at the door. She wanted to say no, to push him away like she had for years, but things were different now. "Give me a few days. Let me talk to her first." Nate nodded. "Okay." She stepped out of the car and made her way up the steps. Just as she reached the door, she turned back. Nate was still watching, still waiting. For the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going anywhere this time. 2 days passed before Savannah called Nate. It wasn't because she doubted his sincerity, but because she needed time. To think, to breathe, to figure out how to have this conversation with Lila. Lila had asked questions about Nate but had not pushed for answers. Savannah could see the uncertainty in her daughter's eyes. So when she finally called, she wasn't sure who was more nervous, her or him. "Savannah," Nate answered on the first ring. She swallowed. "Lila's ready to see you." Silence stretched on the other end before he exhaled. "When?" "This afternoon. If that works." "It works." Savannah hesitated. "I need this to be on her terms, Nate. If she gets overwhelmed, we take a step back. No pressure. No expectations." "Understood." She gave him the address of a nearby park, neutral ground. Somewhere familiar to Lila. Somewhere Savannah could keep an eye on how things unfolded. When they arrived, Lila clung to Savannah's hand, her wide eyes scanning the park. "Is he coming?" Savannah crouched to her daughter's level. "Yes, sweetheart, but we're just here to play. You don't have to talk if you don't want to." Lila nodded, but her grip tightened. Then Nate arrived. He was dressed casually in jeans and a button-down, but he still carried the effortless presence of a man used to control. When he spotted them, he slowed, his eyes solely on Lila. Savannah braced herself, "Hey, Lila," Nate said, his voice soft but steady. "It's nice to see you again." Lila looked at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she turned and ran toward the swings. Savannah felt Nate tense beside her. "That's normal," she murmured. "She needs time." Nate nodded, though his jaw was tight. "I can wait." After a few minutes, Lila slowed her swinging and glanced toward them. Savannah nudged Nate. "Go. Just be there." He moved cautiously toward the swings, taking the one next to Lila. He didn't push, didn't try to force conversation. He simply sat. Minutes passed. Then finally Lila turned to him and asked, "Do you know how to push high?" Nate stilled, then offered a small smile. "I think I can figure it out." She studied him. Then, without another word, she hopped off her swing and stood in front of him expectantly. And just like that, the ice between them cracked. Just a little. Savannah watched as Nate gave his first real push, sending Lila soaring into the air, her laughter ringing through the park. She felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. Maybe, just maybe, this could work after all. The crisp morning air carried the distant laughter of children playing, mixing with the rustling leaves in the park. Savannah sat on a nearby bench, hands clasped in her lap, as she watched Nate and Lila. It had been an hour since they arrived, and the tentative connection between father and daughter was slowly forming, step by step. Lila had started cautiously, testing Nate's patience, watching his every move. But now she was letting him push her swing higher, her squeals of delight filling the air. It was a sight Savannah had never expected to see. "Higher!" Lila called out, giggling. Nate chuckled, his deep voice warmer than Savannah remembered. "Are you sure? You might touch the sky at this rate." "I want to fly," Lila declared. Nate gave a playful sigh before pushing her again, her curls bouncing as she soared higher. Savannah couldn't help but smile, though a sliver of unease still rested in her chest. This was good, for Lila. But could it last? As if sensing her thoughts, Nate walked over and sat beside her on the bench when Lila ran off toward the jungle gym. He leaned forward, forearms resting on his thighs, his eyes fixed on their daughter. "She's amazing." Savannah nodded. "She is. She's also cautious, like she's waiting for me to disappear." His voice held a tightness, a quiet frustration. Savannah sighed. "It's not personal, Nate. She's never had a father before. She just needs time." He turned to face her then, his gaze sharper. "How much time? Weeks? Months? Years?" "Because I've already missed 6 of them." She inhaled deeply, bracing herself. "That's not something you can rush. Trust is built, not forced." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "And what about you? Will you ever trust me again?" Savannah looked away, watching Lila hang upside down from the monkey bars. The question lingered between them, weighted by the past. "I don't know." Nate didn't argue, didn't press. Instead, he nodded, as if accepting that some wounds weren't so easily healed. "I meant what I said. I'm not walking away." Savannah studied him, searching for any cracks in his resolve. "And what happens when your world pulls you back in? When business calls and the demands of your empire take over?" His jaw tightened. "I'll figure it out." That's not an answer. He let out a humorless chuckle. "Savannah, my entire life has been about control, about knowing every move before I make it. But this is different. I don't have a blueprint for this, and it terrifies me. But I know I want to be here, and I want to do it right." Savannah swallowed, his honesty catching her off guard. "That's a start." Before Nate could reply, Lila ran up, panting from exertion. "Mommy, can we get ice cream?" Savannah hesitated, but Nate was already reaching into his pocket. "I know the perfect place." Lila turned to her mother, eyes wide with anticipation. "Can we, please?" Savannah hesitated only a moment before nodding. "All right?" Lila cheered, and Nate flashed a small, satisfied smile. It was the first time Savannah realized just how much this meant to him. Maybe, just maybe, he really wasn't going anywhere this time. The small ice cream parlor was cozy, with pastel-colored walls and the scent of fresh waffle cones filling the air. It was a place Savannah and Lila had visited countless times before, but today the dynamic was different. Nate was here. Lila pressed her face against the glass display, eyes wide with excitement as she scanned the dozens of flavors. "Mommy, can I get 2 scoops?" Savannah smiled, running a hand through Lila's curls. "Just 1 today, sweetheart." Nate, standing beside them, smirked. "What if I get the 2nd scoop for you?" Lila turned to him, hesitant but curious. "You'd do that?" "Of course." He leaned down slightly. "But only if you promise to share a bite with me." Lila giggled. "Okay." Savannah watched the interaction unfold, her heart tightening. This was what she had feared. And yet, what she had secretly hoped for. Nate was slipping into Lila's life in a way she hadn't anticipated, slowly bridging the gap between stranger and father. After placing their orders, they found a small table by the window. Lila eagerly dug into her ice cream, the tip of her nose dusted with chocolate. Nate chuckled as she offered him a spoonful, and without hesitation he took it. "You've got good taste, kid," he said. Lila beamed, clearly proud. Savannah took a slow sip of her coffee, watching them carefully. "You're good with her." Nate set his spoon down, looking at Savannah with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "I want to be." She swallowed, looking away. "She's warming up to you faster than I expected." "That's a good thing, isn't it?" Savannah hesitated. "Yes, but it also scares me." "Why?" She met his gaze. "Because if you leave, if you disappear the way you did before, it'll break her heart, and I won't let that happen." The air between them grew heavier, filled with unspoken history and buried wounds. Nate leaned forward, his voice lower, steadier. "I'm not leaving, Savannah. Not again." She wanted to believe him, but belief wasn't something she had the luxury of giving freely anymore. Lila, oblivious to the tension between them, suddenly perked up. "Can we go to the beach after this?" Savannah started to say no, but Nate beat her to it. "Sounds like a great idea." Lila clapped her hands together, delighted. "Yay," Savannah sighed, running a hand over her face. "Nate." "It's just the beach," he said gently. "Let's just enjoy the day. No pressure." She studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right, the beach it is." As Lila cheered, Savannah couldn't ignore the way her heart pounded. This was more than just a simple outing. This was the beginning of something she might not be able to stop. The drive to the beach was filled with Lila's excited chatter. She had quickly warmed up to the idea of spending more time with Nate, her initial caution melting away like the ice cream she had just devoured. Savannah, however, sat in the passenger seat, gripping the fabric of her dress, unsure of how she felt about the rapid shift in their dynamic. This was what she wanted, for Lila to feel safe, to have both parents in her life. But part of her still feared it was too good to last. As Nate pulled into the parking lot near the shore, the ocean stretched endlessly before them, waves rolling in under the afternoon sun. The scent of salt filled the air, and the distant sounds of children laughing carried on the breeze. Lila unbuckled herself and immediately threw open the car door. "Come on," she squealed, running ahead with the boundless energy only a child could possess. Savannah stepped out more cautiously, brushing stray hair from her face as she turned toward Nate. "You didn't have to do this." He closed his car door and slipped his sunglasses on. "I wanted to." She sighed, knowing that arguing with him was pointless. She's happy. Nate nodded, following Lila's movements as she ran toward the shoreline. That's all that matters. They walked side by side toward the beach, their footsteps falling into rhythm. It felt oddly natural, this fragile peace between them, but Savannah knew better than to trust it. Nothing about their history had ever been simple. As soon as they reached the sand, Lila turned to Nate and grabbed his hand. "Let's build a sandcastle." Nate's eyebrows lifted. "You know, I haven't built one of those in a long time. I might need a professional's help." Lila grinned. "I'm an expert." Savannah watched as her daughter dragged him toward the wet sand, barking instructions as though she had been preparing for this moment her whole life. Nate didn't hesitate, rolling up his sleeves and dropping down beside her, listening intently to every detail. For the first time in years, Savannah saw a different side of him. The man who had once been so rigid, so obsessed with power and control, was now letting himself be guided by the tiny hands of a 6-year-old, and that terrified her. Because if he was truly changing, it meant she would have to confront everything she had held against him for years. She was about to turn away and put some distance between them when she spotted something, or rather someone, watching from a distance. Her breath caught in her throat. A tall woman stood near the entrance to the beach, oversized sunglasses shielding her face, but Savannah recognized her immediately. Olivia Langford, Nate's business rival, a woman who had built an empire in corporate real estate and had never made it a secret that she wanted to take Nate down. Savannah's pulse spiked. Why was Olivia here? Before she could process it, Olivia turned, stepping away and disappearing down the boardwalk. Savannah felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. Something was coming, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Savannah had never been one to believe in omens, but as she watched Olivia Langford disappear into the crowd along the boardwalk, she knew. This was no coincidence. Olivia was calculating, strategic, and never made a move without an agenda. If she had been watching them, it meant she had a plan. Nate stood beside her now, his expression unreadable, but the tension radiating off of him was unmistakable. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. She knows. Savannah turned to him. Knows what? His gaze remained fixed on where Olivia had been moments before. About Lila, about us, and if she knows, she's going to use it. Fear twisted inside her. What does she want? Control, leverage. She wants to push me into a corner, find my weakness, and right now that's you and Lila. His voice was low, edged with something she couldn't quite define. Protectiveness, maybe even desperation. I won't let her do that. Savannah exhaled, trying to steady herself. Then what do we do? Nate finally looked at her, his dark eyes holding an intensity that made her heart pound. We fight. Together. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal meetings and public statements. Olivia had wasted no time in leaking rumors to the press, whispering about Nate's hidden family, questioning his ability to lead Blackwood Investments while managing the fallout of a secret child. Reporters began circling Savannah's home, trying to snap pictures of Lila. The world Nate had once controlled so effortlessly was now invading hers, and she hated every second of it. But Nate had been right. He didn't leave. He shielded her and Lila, hiring security, making sure she was never alone. He stood in front of cameras and made it clear. Lila was his daughter, and he was proud of it. It should have reassured her. But as she sat in her living room, watching his press conference on TV, she felt something else creeping in. Doubt. Not in him, but in herself. Was this the life she wanted for Lila? A world filled with cameras and scrutiny, where every move was analyzed, where a simple trip to the grocery store could end up in the tabloids. She jumped when her phone buzzed. A message from Nate. Almost done with the press conference, coming to you soon. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She needed to talk to him. She needed to tell him what had been weighing on her since the moment Olivia had appeared. She wasn't sure she could do this. When Nate arrived that evening, he looked exhausted but determined. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him, and immediately went to her. "Are you okay? Have the reporters been bothering you?" Savannah shook her head. "They're still out there, but security has kept them back." Nate ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "This won't last forever. Once the story dies down, they'll move on. And what if they don't?" Her voice was quiet but steady. "What if this is our life now? What if Lila grows up being followed, scrutinized? I never wanted that for her." Nate stilled. "What are you saying?" Savannah took a breath, gathering her thoughts. "I'm saying that I need to be sure, that Lila needs stability, and if you're going to be in her life, you have to be in it, not just when there's a crisis, not just when you have time, always." His eyes darkened. "I told you I'm not going anywhere." "Then prove it, not just to me, to her." She stepped closer, searching his face. "Because if you can't, if this is too much, too complicated, you need to walk away now before she gets hurt." The words hung between them, heavy and unforgiving. Then, slowly, Nate reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. He unfolded it and handed it to her. She frowned, taking it. It wasn't what she expected. It was a deed. "What is this?" "A house," he said simply. "Near here. A quiet neighborhood, away from the city, away from the press. Somewhere safe for Lila." Savannah's breath caught. I'm not asking you to move in with me, Savannah. I'm not trying to take over your life. I just want to be close. To be here for her every day, like I should have been from the beginning." Her fingers tightened around the paper. "You'd do that?" "I already did." His voice softened. "Because this isn't just about me anymore." Something inside Savannah broke then. The last wall she had been holding up for so long. Because for the first time she realized Nate had changed. He had chosen them. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes as she let out a shaky breath. "I don't know what happens next." Nate stepped forward, lifting a hand to gently tuck a stray curl behind her ear. "Neither do I. But we figure it out, together." Savannah swallowed the lump in her throat. "Okay." His lips twitched, almost like he was suppressing a smile. "Okay?" She exhaled a small laugh. "Okay." A slow grin spread across his face. And for the first time in a long time, Savannah let herself believe in something she never thought possible. A future. Together. Savannah stood on the front porch of her new home, watching as Lila ran across the yard, her laughter floating through the crisp morning air. The move had been sudden, but necessary. Nate had been right. This house was safe, quiet, and untouched by the chaos of the media frenzy that had followed them for weeks. It was a place where Lila could just be a child, where they could finally breathe. And yet, Savannah's heart still wavered between relief and fear. She turned as she heard the sound of tires crunching on the driveway. Nate stepped out of his car, dressed more casually than she had ever seen him. Dark jeans, a navy sweater, and an easy confidence that felt different from the man she had known years ago. He wasn't here as the CEO of Blackwood Investments. He was just a man trying to be a father. Lila spotted him instantly and dashed toward him. "Nate!" Savannah held her breath, waiting to see what he would do. But there was no hesitation. Nate crouched, arms open, catching Lila as she threw herself against him. He held her tightly, his eyes closing for a moment as if grounding himself in the reality of her presence. Savannah swallowed past the lump in her throat. "You're getting heavier," Nate teased as he stood, Lila now perched on his hip. She giggled. I'm growing. Mommy says I might be tall like you someday. Nate smirked. Then I better start working out more. Savannah crossed her arms, arching a brow. Are you saying you're out of shape? His gaze flicked to hers, playful but still tinged with the weight of everything they had been through. Maybe just enough to need an excuse to stick around. Savannah looked away, focusing on the way Lila beamed in his arms. I made coffee. You want some? Always. Lila wriggled free and ran back toward the yard, announcing that she was building a fairy house. Nate followed Savannah inside, stepping into the kitchen as she poured 2 cups of coffee. For a moment there was silence. Not uncomfortable, but heavy with the things neither of them had yet said. It's nice here, Nate finally said, leaning against the counter. Feels like home. Savannah stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. That's the idea. I meant for me, too. She stilled, her fingers tightening around the spoon. Nate. I'm not pushing, Savannah, He exhaled. I never thought I'd want something like this. A home, a family. But now I can't imagine not wanting it. Not wanting you. She turned to face him fully, her heart pounding. Nate, this has to be real. It can't be something you feel because you think it's the right thing to do. Lila adores you and I... She stopped herself, lowering her voice. I can't go through losing you again. His expression softened, and he stepped closer, gently taking her hands in his. You won't. Savannah searched his face, looking for any trace of doubt. But there was none. Just a man who had once built his life around control and ambition, now choosing something much simpler. Love. Then prove it, she whispered. Nate smiled, then a slow, knowing curve of his lips. I already am. Before she could process his words, he pulled a small envelope from his pocket and pressed it into her palm. She frowned, unfolding the paper inside. A plane ticket. She blinked up at him, confused. New York? I want you to see my world, he said softly. Not the one from before, where I worked myself into exhaustion and shut out the people who mattered. The one I'm building now. The one I want you in. Her breath caught. You mean... I don't want to just be near Lila, Savannah. I want to be part of her life, of yours. And if it takes showing you how serious I am, then that's exactly what I'll do. Savannah swallowed hard. This was real. This was Nate choosing them. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because he wanted to. She glanced at the ticket, then back at him. It's open-ended. His gaze was steady. Because you decide when, and if you do. Silence stretched between them, thick with years of pain and healing. Then finally, Savannah let out a breath and reached for his hand. Okay. Nate's fingers tightened around hers, his smile small but full of promise. Okay. Outside, Lila's laughter rang through the air, the sound of a family finding its way back together. And for the first time in years, Savannah let herself believe that love, real love, was worth the risk.